right, so 60 questions, chapters 7, 8, 9, and 10, roughly about 15 questions on each chapter. You need to know and think about the fact that when we talked about short messages, there's a number of different types of short messages. There's text messaging, there's instant messaging. I need you to reflect back things that we do in instant messaging, things that we do in text messaging. Can we be held liable for those things?
Yes.
Okay. Why? Because they're there, right? It doesn't matter, right? Now, we've talked about the difference, though, and we'll kind of come back through that in a minute. It's different when it's written than when it's oral, and it has a lot to do with, did anyone else hear it, you know, that kind of thing. But absolutely, we can get back to those text messages, and we can get back to emails for those to be used in even lawsuits. We know that social media is taking our world by storm, right? We know people are using Facebook and Twitter and using these as platforms. Is that for social media? Is that for business? Is it for both? Right, we can definitely use that in business as well, right? What about in marketing? Can we use something like Instagram in order to market a specific product or even a brand that we want to market? Or do we feel like instant messaging and or Instagram and Facebook maybe a little too personal for that kind of thing? Started out that way, right? But we have seen it develop into this wonderful marketing tool, right? Okay, in today's world, we have all of these wonderful devices, and we are definitely in what we call the digital age, right? So knowing that, would you say communication is more now or less now? Yes. So at the beginning of the semester, everybody said less, right? Because our heads are always down. But the fact is we are communicating. However, we're just not always communicating efficiently, right? And effectively. So communication is definitely increased. We're more on mobile devices than we've ever been. But the way we communicate is definitely different when we communicate on those. Nobody wants a text message that is a book, right? We want clear, concise, short. How many times have you guys heard me in the class say short, sweet, hard to beat, right? That's what we want. We can get answers a lot quicker than we've ever gotten before. If we're working on a project together, I can have immediate reply. I don't have to wait till the next day to hear you say something. If I'm at a venue and I'm setting up for the company, I can ask you where you want something and I don't have to wait for you to get there. I get much quicker responses with a shorter amount of text that I send to you. And so we need to kind of keep that in mind. What is probably the number one means of of communication in the business world? What's probably the one we use the most? Email. Email by far is probably what is used most in the business world. Now, that may change. People actually thought, remember we discussed, is email going to go away? People started kind of talking in that, but those that are out there in the business world and know how to communicate correctly, more and more are saying it's not going anywhere, at least not for a while. Now, a decade from now, that may be different. We may see a more shift of social media and the way that it plays and how that evolves and how we communicate through that. But at the time, right now, it's kind of two separate things, both means of communication, but there's just things that those types of things can't do that email can do for us. So still probably the most appropriate for short messages and what have you in the office. What do you think would be, first of all, let me ask you this. What are all the parts of an email? What are all the parts of an email? A subject line. Mm-hmm. Right, the body, an opening, a body, a conclusion, that final, that opening greeting, the final salutation, so to speak. What do you think out of all of those parts would probably be the most important part?
The
Why would you think that?
It tells them what they need to know immediately.
Okay.
To read first.
There you go. And we know, we talked about email as bombarding us. It isn't going away. And we talked about ways that we could kind of get around that, checking it only once a day, twice a day. But when we're doing that, when we're on the receiving line, there are things that we can do to only check the most important things. Subject lines would determine what we leave, what we take on right away, that kind of thing. So they're very crucial. They're very important. Like I said, we do talk about how we can kind of allow emails can cause someone to like really, they can be detrimental to someone in business if you don't know how to handle them. And we talked about that a little bit. But we did talk about things that we could do that would alleviate some of that, which were, I just mentioned one. What is it? Don't check it all day long. We hear this go on all the time, but if you try to check it every time you hear that go off, you know, then you're in trouble, right? So you don't want to do that. I'm seeing now that I actually have a text message from someone. I shouldn't have checked it. It's one of my kids. And so you want to make sure that you're doing it at set times. You know, I'm going to check it once a day at this time, or twice a day at this time and this time. Let people know. It's okay to let people know, or put that on your tagline at the bottom. Check emails every so often. Now, we did talk about memos. They still have a place in the workplace, right? Memos. They're very similar to emails in lots of ways, but they're also different. When would I want to use a memo instead?
Something regular, something that's long.
Yes, internal. We're gonna want to use it for an internal. When we want to be more formal than an email, we would want to use it. What did somebody else just say?
I said like a general announcement, like it's like an office-wide type thing.
Yes, but we got to be careful too. Like, not everybody has email. We talked about that. So even in your workplace, maybe everybody's not on email. So like, if you think, I'm going to just send it to everybody, but maybe some of the people that are in the factory down on the floor, maybe they don't do email or whatever. So there are a lot of different reasons we would want to use a memo in place of an email. Most times we feel like email is a little bit friendlier and it goes out there, but not everybody has it. Sometimes we need something that's a little bit more formal. Sometimes, like we said, it's too long to go in an email, that kind of thing, so we need to be careful. They are the same, though, in that they pretty much follow that same format that we've talked about, that opening, closing, or body and closing. So they do follow some of the same things. We talked about when texting, there's certain things we want to make sure that we're following the proper etiquette for texting. What are some of the things we talked about when following etiquette? What's some of the things, do's and don'ts of texting, I guess I should ask.
Text on the office, or like while you're in a meeting with somebody.
Right, we don't want to be texting while we're meeting. That makes it sound like that's not important. We want to be sure that, don't text at 1 o'clock in the morning. If you wouldn't call at that time, you shouldn't text at that time. If we're delivering information that's very private, very sad, detrimental, that's not the kind of things you're going to do in text. We don't want to terminate someone's employment in a text, right? So there are certain times and just etiquette that we would want to follow when texting. So we need to be very careful about that. The internet, the invention of the internet has done many things. So for me to throw out just a round thing and say, what has the internet done for us? So much, right? And we've talked about, would you ever want to go back? I think I offered that question and posed that question to you guys once. Would you want, if you had the choice and you could say, I want to go back to not having the internet, how many people would want to do that? You'd be surprised at some people that do. It's just too much too soon. But most of us are like, why? What are some of the reasons what has the internet done for us? Yes, we can research so much. Everything is right at our fingertips, right? And it empowers. Everybody can put something on the internet, right? It makes all of us feel like we have this power to create and put it out there. We didn't talk a lot about blogs, but one of the things about blogs that's so great is you can get feedback from customers very quickly. So if they're reading your blog at Nike or whatever, we can get on and see what customers are thinking. We can see the feedback from that. It's really cheap, right? To be able, we're not putting out our money into surveys. Of course, now we have the ability to do tech surveys, but before we don't have to hire people to go out and stand in the street, so to speak, to get their feedback from surveys. So it's definitely cheaper. One of the cautions of sending things electronically that we need to be careful about is the fact that yeah, but they're not always private, right? So we tend to feel like, oh, this is just between me and Lacey. This is just an email that went between the two of us. But really, there are so many ways that can get interrupted. And we feel like a lot of times that maybe something handwritten is vulnerable, but which is more vulnerable to getting intercepted? The digital, right? Yeah, the electronic. Can you get in trouble for negative comments online?
Yes.
Okay, so we've done 4 chapters, and we're already through the first chapter here. But we've done 4 chapters over the course of the last little bit, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So we've talked about short messages. We've talked about routine, just very routine positive messages. We've talked about negative messages. We've talked about entertaining messages briefly in one of the sections, and persuasive. So mostly negative, persuasive, and just routine positive. What do we spend most of our time writing on a day-to-day basis? You're going to spend a lot of time with negative?
No.
Now, we do spend a lot on persuasive, more and more, but I don't think that it's outgrown yet just normal, everyday passing of information. I don't think you guys need to know that. Before we write anything, we should do what? Know our what?
Our audience?
We know our audience, but even before that, what did we just talk about even today with the presentation? Say it again. What's our purpose? Right? So the very first thing we need to ask before we write or speak anything is, what is the purpose of this? Do I need to even be writing this? What's the purpose behind this? That's the first thing we do. Okay. So we just did a little bit of talking about this, so I might not even need to hit this again. But we talked about a lot of things being digital and emailing and what have you. But then we also have, believe it or not, we still send business letters, right? And so what's the difference? When would we prefer email over business letter or business letter over email?
Like a business letter would be more like a contract or things like that. Things have to be in writing.
Right, a contract, something that needs to be in writing when we're reaching externally and going outside. But more routine things like money situations, a business letter might be better about things like that. Why do we care about using quality white space? I hit this a lot. I always talk about readability. Are you using your white space? Are you using bullets? Why? Why is that even important? What are we trying to do as a writer? Why do we want to have our communications? Why do we want that to be easily read? What does it do for our reader? It's not overwhelming. It makes it quicker, saves them time, it's easier to understand. Okay, we talked a lot about direct strategies and indirect strategies. What's the difference, guys? Come on. Direct is what? Very to the point. We're not. Oh, you're talking about like U-form, like when we use U-form. Not so much that. I'm just talking about like when we are specifically giving negative, like if we're having to give negative news. We talked about how we could use a buffer, kind of like, uh-oh, mom, I broke the plate. We don't just come out and say that kind of thing. And so we typically use, well, first of all, between direct and indirect, what do we want to use the most usually? Direct. We want to use active voice, right? We want to use active voice, and we want to be very direct because short, sweet, hard to beat. We want to get right to the point. Time is money most of the time in business writing, right? But occasionally we have those situations where it's really not appropriate just to come out and blurt out who did what wrong or what we did wrong, or we want some cushion there. And so in those cases, we would use indirect, right? There's a few that you're just going to have to know. I can't really give you any information. You're just going to have to, it's kind of like which of the best is worded correctly, and there's not really much that I can do. The hope is that MindTap has prepared you for those 2 or 3. Okay, so we talked about direct claims, like when we need to explain something that's not right or something that's not working because we want something corrected. And then from those claims, we can do adjustments if we can for our customers. If they've written us a claim, we're going to give them an adjustment back and say, yes, we can take care of that for you. We can fix that, or we can give you a refund, or we'll have that in your bank, ASAP, or we'll send that new, part right out to you. But when we're requesting those and we're writing an actual direct claim, like if we're telling, remember there was the one in there about coming back and fixing the fence. It was breaking down. I think maybe you guys didn't have that one, but there's one that we do that's like that. So we're setting forth a direct claim, some kind of something that we want done. In that opening, what do we want to do first? Do we want to use direct or indirect strategy first of all? Direct, right? So we're doing a direct strategy if we're doing a direct claim or a quick claim, right? So we want to use direct strategy. And so we want to open with, we can get them on our side, maybe compliment them, or say, I agree that this is whatever, but then we want to state that problem right away. Let them know, what is it that you're wanting them to do? Do you want them to credit your account? Do you want them to replace the fence? Do you want them to come back and re-shampoo the carpet? What is it exactly that you're wanting the receiver to do? What is the action that you're wanting them to take? Remember that that we do have to be careful in the business world apologizing, because it can open us up for liability. But we do know that people like to hear apologies. So it is something that we do. It's not that we don't apologize. We just need to know where our parameters are in apologizing, okay? And so we have to be careful, but it's not that apologies shouldn't be given. It's just that we need to know when it's appropriate to apologize and what our parameters are. And sometimes we need to even talk to those that are in legal counsel before we apologize, but we need to, it's not that you can't apologize. We talked about sending out just goodwill messages and how it's important that we're, if you're going to send something to tell someone about doing a good job, we want to do it quickly after they've done it, and we want to be very sincere when we do it. We want to be quick to do it. I don't feel like I need to go back over anymore. I'm blue in the face talking about phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 of the writing pattern, so I don't feel like I need to go back and do a lot of that. Okay, make sure you know the difference, like I talked to you about. What is abusive language? We talked about that. I'm trying to think if we talked about this before I just give it away. Know that something is actionable if a lawsuit could result from it. okay? So we say things like we talked about, but if nobody hears those things, you know, or nobody, so it's not like everything we say is under a microscope, but if it's actionable, or abusive language can be actionable, is considered actionable if it's something we could actually use in a lawsuit. We learned the importance, we talked about in certain situations how we have to be careful about what we say because of things like that. So remember we said no good guy syndrome, right? So just because you want to make someone feel better about the fact they didn't get picked for a job interview, remember we talked about that? You can't say, hey, well, you were the best one, but they went with another, because remember in that lawsuit. We also can't just make up and say, even things that we don't think we're saying that are bad. Remember the guy that wrote, turned someone down for a tour and said, I don't think it's a good idea, it could be dangerous. And then later someone got hurt in the same facility and they went back and found that guy's email because he had used the word dangerous, and they were able to use that. So we have to be very careful about that. And also you can't assume, you need to keep very clear what's your personal opinion and what's the opinion of the organization. Right? So that's something else that can set us up for lawsuits. Sometimes we just make these statements and there are personal opinions, but we say it very confidently wearing a branded shirt with the company logo on it, and so it feels very much to the person receiving it like it's the company's opinion. So you need to make very clear when writing communication or an oral communication, this is my personal, or, you know, if it's the company's. So be careful, especially when you're representing the company. We talked about all the reasons we would use direct, right? If we have a hostile audience, if it's, if we know exactly how that person's going to receive it. But even with direct, with negative news, there are certain cases we would use direct. What were some of those cases that we talked about? Even when negative, most of the time you're going to go with indirect, but there are some cases that we do direct, and what would that be? When the person themselves wants it. Sometimes people are like, don't hem-haw with me, I want to know. So just come right out and tell me. Sometimes there are those people that just don't get a hint kind of people, you know, where you know firmness is needed, and so you would need to do it there as well. We already talked about direct and indirect enough. There's a lot of people, we talked about this, that feel like, is it okay, is it ethical to use indirect strategy? Yeah, but we know some people feel a little weird about it. It's kind of like you're hiding something in the mix. It's kind of like, would you feel negative if you slipped kale into your kid's brownie? You know what I'm saying? They don't know they're eating something healthy. And so some people are like, I feel bad. I should tell them they're actually eating carrots, you know, in this muffin, you know, and it's really, even though they like it. And so sometimes people feel that way about indirect strategy. They feel like, you know, you should just get to the point. We had a good conversation about that in class. And Andrew brought up a couple of things. I think it was you, Andrew, that said, you know, doesn't that make you feel, or maybe it was Mark, and we were talking about, but it is ethical. There are ways you can do it unethically, but if you do it and you do it right, it's ethical. We're getting there, guys. We're about 2/3 of the way. We talked about buffers. What is a buffer? Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be a joke, but a buffer is usually that thing we put in where we talked about that great sandwich, you know, when I talked about, as a teacher, especially when I was teaching elementary, and a parent comes in, you don't just start with Johnny drives me crazy, or Johnny can't learn anything, or Johnny's failing, right? We always start with a buffer. We put something good in there, and then we have the negative, you know. And we even learned on some messages, it doesn't come till the very last. We had, you know, the buffer and then our explanation and our reasons before we ever even got to the no. And so a buffer is an effective tool to use, but it's used usually when we're using indirect strategy or giving negative news. And you're going to have to be able to identify a good buffer. We talked a lot about, and you did an activity dealing with active and passive voice. Remember, active voice is when the subject is actually performing the action of the verb, okay? Passive voice is when that's not the case. the subject is not directly performing. And so remember you had to take about 6 sentences and you had to flip them. They were in active voice and you had to make them passive under that chapter when we talked about negative news. So you'll need to be able to identify that. We also learned the value of using a subordinate clause in order to help us with negative news. Remember all those sentences that started with, although smoking is not allowed in so much of the room, comma, we've provided these areas for you to smoke. So when we're saying something negative, we can use that subordinate clause to kind of house it in so it doesn't come across so negative or so, especially if we know they're not going to accept it well. I think we got that. We also talked about sometimes, so we said, okay, what are some of these techniques for negative news? We can use indirect strategy. We can use passive voice instead of active. We can hide it in a subordinated clause. And then that last section of that activity that we did was, we only did 3 of them, but we talked about how you can imply. You don't even ever have to say no. You just kind of imply you're not going to get your strawberries until you pay. You don't have to say we're not shipping them, but you can say as soon as payment is made, your strawberries will go out. Now, we didn't say you're not getting your strawberries until you pay your money, but we implied that they can't be shipped until then. And so sometimes you have to learn that you can just imply. I think we've already hit that quite a bit. When we're trying to size up, oh goodness, okay, we analyze our audience and now we're trying to decide, do we use direct or do we use indirect strategy? There's a number of things that you can think about when that. You can think about, what's my purpose? What is my goal? That will help you decide if you want to use indirect or direct. What's the situation? Is it a situation, like is it a termination? You're sizing up the whole quality of the situation. You're also deciding, what's my audience? How are they going to react? Who are they? Are they going to be hostile? Are they going to be very sad when they hear this news? So there's a number of different factors that go into us deciding whether or not to use indirect or direct strategy. If it is a statement that is false and it hurts someone's reputation, what do we call that? Defamation. Now, if it's written, it's libel, right? It's libel. We are so close. Now we're talking about persuasive. We're in the last chapter. You need to remember that when we started talking about this chapter, when we started talking about chapter 10 and persuasive, that we use it more and more now. We're finding it. I don't feel like it's overtaken positive messages yet, but we are finding more and more, especially with social media, people are using the ability to persuade more and more. It has become more complex. It's very personal, okay? It's more complex. It's very personal. It's no longer just for people that are selling things. Used to, you only thought of people using persuasion were those car salesmen. That's not the case anymore. There's a lot of different people that utilize it. And persuasion can reach so far now because of social media. When we do persuasive, though, to be ethical, we have to be very careful. We need to make sure that we don't jeopardize our credibility. We have to be careful that that we don't just try to strike fear in people. Like if you don't do this, especially like when you're selling things to specific demographics of people, or you don't want to play on people that, like, if you don't do this, this could damage your whole rest of your life or your children or generations. You don't want to incite fear. That's not a good thing to do. Always, always, always the first thing we should do is decide on what our purpose. They just keep coming back to some of those same questions. 3x3 writing process, just in case there's someone still sitting out there that don't remember. 3x3 writing process is what? What's the first step? We analyze, right? Then the second step, organize, and then the third step, revise, right? Basically, that's it. We analyze, we organize and write, and then we revise. So it's pre-writing, if you can think of it as that, drafting, revising, okay? When you're trying to persuade, you are good at what you do, and you are more effective at persuading if you can anticipate what? Right. If you can anticipate not just that there will be resistance, but also what type and how can I counteract that before I ever go into it, right? We talked about certain ways to keep persuasion ethical. Remember we talked about not trying to, I walked way over there and I like diverting someone's attention. So you don't overemphasize one thing so something else is kind of riding on the skirt, so to speak, on the contract or in what you're saying. You don't overemphasize something, but you also don't omit things, right? You don't accidentally leave out things when you're persuading people to do something. And you don't exaggerate, something and make, it's now or never when you know very well they could get in and get the same deal in 2 weeks, right? Kind of thing. I think we've hit all those things. We did talk about something that's different with today's organizations and corporations in that things are becoming a lot more, because of the digital age that we're in the workplace. Remember we talked about how things are moving a lot more lateral, right? So it's compressing a lot more. It's not like this long ladder and this hierarchy. It's more of this, it's really blurred now, as far as that order of hierarchy is kind of blurred in today's digital age. When persuading, it's very important that you point out the audience's benefit. We talked about it's very important to try to quantify things, right? When we talked about, don't just say, hey, I can increase your sales. Tell them by how much you can, if you can show that and be able to demonstrate that. Hey, I'm going to save you a lot of money. Try to quantify that. How much money are you going to try to save me? In reverse of that, if one of the obstacles or maybe one of the resistance is going to be, or some of the resistance is going to be, that's way too much money, or we can't do that as a company. If you already have a plan and how to kind of maybe break it down for them in smaller units and show this is how we're going to build up to that, that could help as well. So be both active and proactive in that when talking about dollars, so to speak. And then I told you I'd give you this when we talked about press releases. Remember I said there's going to be one question on there. There always is, and we never really go over press releases a lot. But just know that if it's a good press release, it's going to appeal to the specific audience it's supposed to appeal to. Okay? That's it. That is the review. Now, go and make a good grade.